Hello and welcome. The topic I'm covering today has been a contentious one at times. It is one that has invited a significant amount of debate, which is often heated, and both sides are guilty of not listening to each other at times. Despite the controversy, it is my belief that there are a significant number of people in the middle who are open to discussion and who are trying to carve an effective path forward. I'm not someone who believes that conversation should be handled by not listening to one another and silencing either position or any position within the debate. As John Stuart Mill famously pointed out in On Liberty, he who knows only his own perspective knows little of that. In that spirit, I intend to wander into this treacherous territory, aware of the risks that come with speaking on a topic where people can be misrepresented and attacked for their opinions. I welcome all feedback that comes to me, positive and negative, and I see it as an opportunity to learn and to grow. In that spirit, I will be discussing Material Girls: Why Reality Matters for Feminism by Kathleen Stock. Kathleen Stock was a lecturer of she was a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex until her opinions attracted negative attention and harassment from people who felt they were unacceptable. Rather than engaging in meaningful conversation, they decided to harass and hound her, and the university in this instance failed in their duty to protect their staff and to protect freedom of speech. She's now a lecturer at the University of Austin, Texas. So, with all that said, I invite you to come with me and dive into the depths of Gender and the Depths of Material Girls by Kathleen Stock. Finishing this book recently was actually the second time that I've read this book, and I remember having a significant reflection after the first one about language and the importance of language. And one of the things that I love that analytical philosophers do, and one of the things that I love about reading a philosophy book like this, is that not only do I learn about the subject in question, but I can learn about the philosophical process and how to think more effectively by observing someone else who is thinking effectively as they do it. And one of the things I think that Kathleen Stock was aiming at in this is to basically recognize that this is a incredibly complex subject that becomes very difficult to follow at times and can be quite daunting to get into. And so what she was doing was trying to create clarity and explore what we mean by the terms that we're using in it, or what different people mean, because at times people are using the same terms to refer to different things. I think she actually managed that, considering the complexity and the contentiousness of the subject. I think that Stock navigated this admirably, showing compassion for all those involved and keeping the people affected at the center of everything she did. So there was although she was striving to be balanced and avoid just taking a ideological position, I think there was a real ethical approach to it. Um, so one of the things that I was reflecting on, I will return to the story for my reflections from the first read of the book. One of the things I was reflecting from my second read of the book recently was about the miracle of human communication and how much complexity is implicit and unconscious within our interactions. So, anyone who's tried to get to grasps with the English language will know that there are quite a number of words that will refer to more than one thing or have multiple potential definitions. It may be the case that the majority of words have multiple definitions, but don't quote me on that. That's speculative. I don't actually know. So, an example that's relevant to this subject is the word sex. If I were to say the word sex on its own with no other context, you would not know whether I meant sex as in the act of sexual intercourse or whether I meant sex as in the noun for male or female biological sex. That's quite a straightforward example, but it illustrates the point that without the context around it, then you can't necessarily know what I mean. When it becomes more complex and there's more definitions at play, you might be able to differentiate between the versions of sex that I may mean by the word that precedes it. Say, if it's preceded by a word that implies it is a noun, then you know I'm referring to biological sex. Whereas if it's preceded by a verb or preceded by a word that would indicate it's a verb, then you know that I'm referring to sex as in the act of sex. But there are other words that are far more complex than this, where we're actually relying on the entire sentence for context, but also the body language, the intonation, the emphasis, our prior knowledge of the person who's communicating to us. But we do this at in such a unconscious manner that we don't even know that we're calculating all of this to triangulate a meaning from a given word. But we also do this with remarkable rapidity because we can do it and just keep a conversation flowing. We're not having to stop every few seconds to ponder and reflect on what was meant by what was just said. And that's quite a remarkable skill. But it also has a downside. It's a double-edged sword, if you will, because while it's miraculous and incredibly effective considering how complex it is, it also has the issue of when there are multiple definitions of a word involved, we could be talking past each other, communicating using different definitions without ever being aware of it. So if I was to say, refer to, oh, let's say when someone's talking about a doctor who's helped to deliver a baby, they might say they sexed the baby. If you were under the impression they were saying to sex as in the sexual intercourse act rather than to categorize, you may have a very different reaction to that doctor than were they just observing the sex of the baby at birth. Um, and one of the places that Stock does this most effectively, to the point where in a recent piece of writing I was doing, which is actually why I read this book the second time in the first place. I went back to this book to look at the breakdown of the different definitions of gender that she had suggested. Now, to give you a quick overview of this, the first definition of gender would be a synonym for sex that is more polite. So rather than having the connotations of sexual intercourse, we would refer to what's the gender of the baby. You have gender reveal parties. Do you know the gender? This is using it as a synonym for sex, but does not feel as crass. It doesn't have any sort of social connotations to it. And some people will simply use the word sex in that place, but it can be considered or construed by some people as less polite somehow. A second definition of gender emerges from Simone de Beauvoir, who was a famous feminist who who wrote, "One is not born but becomes a woman," which is basically to say that there is a social role of woman that one comes to fulfill, and this later got uh, labeled gender. I don't think, to my knowledge, de Beauvoir actually used the term gender in that context, but it later became used to refer to that. And there's sort of different ways you can come at that concept of there being a role that one uh, comes to fulfill, because it sort of suggests that there's a developmental element of it, but there's also it suggests a set of, I guess, stereotypes and expectations. And those expectations are potentially ones that are sort of socially imposed, but they're also potentially emergent properties. So this is something that happens when there is an average, for example. And I think people don't quite understand what we're referring to when we talk about averages in terms of groups of people. Um, it's the easiest way to explain it would be it's called population thinking, and to explain it, there would be a classical example that people would always object to: the average number of children being 2.5 children. Everyone knows that no family has 2.5 children, but when you add up the number of families and add up the number of children and do the maths, you come out with the number 2.5. Now, within that, some families have no children and some families have, I don't even want to hazard a guess at what the most highest number of uh, children in a single family is. But um, we sort of know that when it comes to a figure like 2.5 children, because it's immediately implausible, but we don't always think of that when we're talking about averages. So an example of like a well established psychological difference between the groups of men and women is that on average men are less agreeable than women. That doesn't mean that all men are less agreeable than all women, or that all women are more agreeable than all men. It just means that when you average out the groups, you get this difference. And there could be some people who that doesn't describe at all. And it's entirely possible that the exact average amount of agreeableness to the degree of accuracy we have in measuring something like that doesn't actually exist within either the male or the female population, because everyone is just on a sort of spectrum of to what degree this trait exists within them. Um, and so you can get a social expectation for the sexes that emerges just from people sort of intuitively over time gaining an idea of what the average is they can expect, that probably serves them a better than chance tool for guessing what someone might be like. An example of this that you would probably see play out reasonably often would be if you work in, say, a manual labor job, like in a warehouse where it's predominantly male. It's usually a reasonably safe bet that you can ask about football or talk about football. Now, it's not that uncommon for you to come across someone who I don't actually like football, and to the point where there are memes about it where it'll say, okay, we'll just sit in silence then, mate. But by knowing that on average, in particularly in British culture, men are more likely to be interested in football, you can sort of make a safe assumption. The problem from that would come when you seek to impose it. You say, well, you're a man, you have to like football, rather than saying, okay, you don't like football, I guessed wrong. Anyway, I've sort of tangented slightly about the sources of this, but basically the idea is that there is a social expectation attached to that role. Now, a third definition of gender that emerges is probably comes from the psychologist, the child psychologist and pediatrician John Money. Now, John Money is famous for his role in the Raymer twins experiment. With these are two twins, both born male, who needed a circumcision at a young age, not castration, as my brain keeps trying to get me to say, circumcision at a young age due to a medical complication. Now, David, the first child, underwent this process and there was an issue. It went wrong and he was left with quite significant scarring to his genitalia, which led his parents not to let his twin undergo the procedure. And luckily, his twin recovered without the need for the medical intervention anyway. Now, John Money believed that you could be socialized into a gender role. So if you were treated as a girl from a young age, then your development pathway would be the one that makes you a girl, and that everything is effectively socially constructed and learned. So he convinced Raymer's parents to raise him as a girl, and they did so. There was a number of issues with Raymer sort of demonstrating distress, and he also, interestingly, in a lot of the experiments that Money did, Raymer would show an interest in male typical toys or behaviors, but Money would often ask leading questions and lead him in a different direction. Anyway, Money basically reported a lot of this inaccurately and would sort of manipulate the data to achieve a positive outcome for his hypothesis. Um, then, when he was an adolescent, Raymer's parents told him about the process and the fact that he was biologically a male, and he immediately reverted back to living as a male. He suffered significant emotional and psychological harm from this, and unfortunately committed suicide in his 30s. Disproving Money's hypothesis, but it didn't stop John Money from promoting this and people embracing it to this day to some degree. Then you get a fourth definition of gender that arises from post-structuralist, postmodernist thought, such as Judith Butler. I was reading Judith Butler the other day. I don't recommend anyone tries reading Judith Butler. It's exceptionally difficult, exceptionally obtuse, and she's very rarely saying anything particularly insightful or of a great deal of value. It's yeah. It's an act of sadism to try and read Judith Butler, I would say. Sadism, masochism. I've forgotten what I've having a momentary lapse of remembering which way round that works. Whichever one involves deliberately inflicting suffering on yourself. Um, so by Butler's definition of gender, it was something that was performative, that was based on your internal sense of yourself, and it could be changed at any given time. And in fact, Butler objected to categorization at all, and said that gender should be something that's political, that's used to subvert categories, because categories are inherently oppressive because they exclude. And that is a valid point, that categories exclude, in that it's valid as an observation. what it fails to recognize is the necessity of categories excluding. So, although I've now stolen quite a lot of material from my writing, um, I will use an example that I used in my writing. The only way you know what I'm referring to if I talk about a door is because I'm not referring to a window, I'm not referring to a wall, I'm not referring to a ceiling. You know what a door is when I say door because we have a category of door that excludes all items that are not a door. And when you get rid of categorization, you lose the ability to communicate effectively between two people, partially due to the issue I was highlighting earlier that we already, when we have categories that exclude, can have an issue where we have different interpretations of the same words. So, by Butler's definition of gender, it can be changed at any given moment, sort of as a whim, and may even be done deliberately so to undermine any attempts to get to grips with it. So I haven't said very much original within that. I'm mostly taking stuff from this book because Stock did such a good job of exploring and outlining this. And I was considering what the implications are of having these interchangeable definitions without a clear way of delineating between what they are. So, if someone were to say to me they wanted to change their gender and they were using the first definition of gender, which refers to sex, that's not something that's possible to do because although we have a number of medical procedures that can enable you to look more like the opposite sex, we don't have the ability to change one's chromosomes. We don't have chromosomes, I mispronounced it, or to change one's gametes, or in some ways we can't achieve often a perfect cosmetic adjustment even, although there are some people who achieve a far more realistic cosmetic alteration than others. But the sort of the way that biologists categorize male and female in a given species is based on the gametes or the sex cells that they produce, with males producing the smaller, more mobile gametes and females producing the larger, less mobile gametes. Now, Stock does do a good job of countering many of the arguments because you sort of hear these arguments immediately in response to a definition like that, where they'll say, well, some people can't produce sex cells. So, for example, if they're infertile, um, and that is true, but it's not an exception that disproves the rule because if they were following a healthy developmental pathway, then they would produce those, but there can be any sort of disruption that occurs within that. And we're still able to identify by a number of physiological features, including things like chromosomes. And we can still identify the sex through that. And the chromosomes thing also gets argued against by the existence of differences of sexual development, previously known as intersex, which are often overrepresented overrepresented in the figures. So people will manipulate the figures to look like there are a lot more people with differences of sexual development than there are, so that it can sort of suit their point. But they also include differences of sexual development that are still very clear to delineate between which sex they belong to, and actually cases of a sort of true hermaphroditism where you would not be able to distinguish which sex a person belongs to are exceptionally rare. And their exceptional rareness does not mean they don't warrant consideration. It just means that they don't um, disprove the existence of binary sex. All categories that exist anywhere have test cases at the edges. They don't have to be completely perfect. And we would expect, for all sorts of reasons, basically due to the sort of chaos and complexity of the world, that there is always going to be an exception to any rule you create. Um, so anyway, my point from that is that we can we can provide medical interventions that will allow people to appear more like the opposite sex if they wish. And it doesn't even, cosmetic interventions don't have to be about appearing like the opposite sex. We already have ones that um, address just pure physical appearance and enable people to um, extenuate the features of their own sex. Um, but there is also cosmetic alteration. You know, people have tattooed their eyeballs or have tattoos, or piercings and things like that. So people do have procedures to make themselves appear different from their then sort of organic appearance, I guess you could say. Um, so if we're using this definition, this first definition of gender, then when someone says they want to do that, the answer, you can't change your sex. If we're using this fourth definition, then not only can gender be changed, it can be in constant flux and can't be pinned down effectively and can be changed at any given moment. Um, I'm not actually going to sort of make a case for any of these definitions being inherently more or less true than the other. Um, I'm more interested in what it means, and one of the reflections that came to me most prominently after my first reading of the book was that we've allowed it to become very complicated and difficult to navigate this idea of a distinction between sex and gender. And whichever sort of definition of gender or whichever conceptualization of gender you deem to use, if you didn't believe that there was a separate social role from sex, which is, I'm going to use gender in that to refer to that just for the sake of ease. So if you didn't believe this distinction between gender and sex previously, then it's very hard to deny that there is now a social category of gender. Because we have seen the proliferation of different self-proclaimed gender identities and of people referring to themselves with different terminology and even presenting themselves in different ways in the world. So, although I don't really believe that, at least not for quite some time, people have argued that all differences between men and women are biological, and Judith Butler admittedly did argue that they're all socially constructed. The vast majority of people will recognize that there is both a biological and a social element to manhood and womanhood. But regardless of whether there previously was a social construct of gender, we now have a social construct of gender. And that's not a problem. But there are problems associated with the way that we've been going about it. Um, so one of the things that really stuck out to me is that people often argue for this separation of sex and gender, but then will adopt the language of sex and use it to refer to gender. So, for example, they will say that a trans woman, i.e., someone who's born male but now identifies as a woman, is a woman. You hear this sort of slogan, trans women are women, said quite often. But if you believe that they are women in the literal sense, you would have to believe that the category, you would have to believe one of two things. You either have to believe that the category that we use to refer to biological sex, that they're basically, their transition has enabled them to change biological sex, which, as I've said, it can't have done. Or you would have to believe that they are female. So you would have to believe that that category that, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words a little bit. You would have to believe that the category that we use to refer to biological women is either broader than we previously defined it, and so includes people outside of that based on how they present themselves socially, or you would have to believe that they have literally changed sex either through cosmetic procedures or through the power of their minds or through the power of social recognition, which is an impossibility, as I highlighted previously. Or alternatively, you would have to redefine the category of woman to refer to anyone who um, self-identifies or has a female gender identity. And I think that gender identity, so this is said, the 2 points that I'm going to make were made in the opposite order within the book. So unfortunately, me explaining gender identity now is a little bit more complicated than it would be in Stock's book, but this is why she's the professional philosopher and I'm not. So a gender identity would be something like one strong sense of identification with a concept of that gender. So I'll define it as such because the concept of gender may not be male or female. It could be any of the number of concepts that have been created for this. So there's a big issue with changing concepts like woman to which has previously been used to refer to biological sex, to refer to gender identity, as in anyone who sort of feels they are a woman is a woman. Or there's quite a number of big problems for this. A friend recently shared an article with me where a woman, a biological woman who identified as a man, was in hospital for an emergency, and it transpired that they were pregnant, and there was complications that arose from basically this not being picked up on because they had not identified themselves as biologically female. So that's sort of a very extreme situation where this definition of gender identity rather than sex for the categories of man and woman can obfuscate important information. Another area where it has extreme consequences is if you consider sexuality. So there are effectively three categories which people fall into, which is heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual. There is a whole range of new sexual identities, but for now, I'm going to focus on the sort of three that have been in the three terms that have been in common use for the longest period of time. So heterosexual or homosexual, in fact, I'll just focus on those two for ease of explaining. So heterosexual or homosexual, a heterosexual is someone who's attracted to the opposite side of the sex, the opposite side of the sex binary, sorry. And homosexual is someone who's attracted to the same sex. These are defined by sex, and it's actually interesting because many of the people who would argue in favor of gender identity as this basis are the same people who would have argued in favor of naturally arising homosexual, and that being the justification for homosexuality being accepted. which is actually a misleading point anyway, because it wouldn't matter what the causes for homosexuality arising are. You can still make the case for it being accepted regardless of whether it's natural or developmental or whatever causes it. um but that's a side point. But all the evidence suggests that sexuality is relatively fixed and it's not something that can be changed. And this is something that many people have rallied against, the concept of conversion therapy, where people who are homosexual were subject to quite horrendous mistreatment by people in an attempt to cure their gayness and make them heterosexual. Um, if you if you then define sexuality by this definition of gender rather or gender identity rather than sex, then if a woman becomes someone who possesses a female gender identity or who believes themselves to be a woman, then lesbians can be told that they must be attracted to a biological man who identifies themselves as a woman, or the same situation in inverse, which most people would consider to be quite morally reprehensible. The idea that someone would be um, imposed upon or sort of pressured to engage in a sexual act with someone who they don't feel an attraction to based on their sexuality or other people's sexual preferences don't have to be rational or justified, they just are, is generally the sort of position that most people have taken for quite some time now. Um, so if you change the definition of an existing words to refer to gender or gender identity rather than to sex, you create a large number of complications. And I've only touched the surface of this. Stock gives many more examples, and I'm sure there are more examples beyond what she's brought up as well. But it got me thinking the first time after I read it. I was like, why would it be that we have to adopt the language of sex to refer to gender if they're distinct? Because it undermines the concept that gender and sex are two distinct categories. So I sort of feel, and I don't think I've shifted on this despite reflecting on it for a couple of years probably now. I sort of feel that this is something that we need to be very careful of, and that we should be seeking to establish new language for new concepts while retaining a recognition of biological sex. Um, and I don't think that needs to be acknowledged in every circumstance. I think there are circumstances where there would be no issue with ignoring biological sex for the sake of politeness. But I think that we can't presume that to apply everywhere, because there are many situations where it does have a significance, a couple of which I've just highlighted. So on gender identity as a concept, I think that this is probably the most valuable part I found in this book, I would say. There's a lot of valuable parts, but if I had to say there's one big takeaway for me, it's this um, identification model of gender identity that Stock proposed. And I think it pretty much hits the nail on the head of what gender identity is and what it's used to mean, because I think it accounts for pretty much all of the data that we have, all of the modern research that's come out about it. It's also maps pretty perfectly onto. I was asked to give a presentation about a year ago on the subject of gender. For those who know me well, you'll know that I've been immersed in the world of gender for a number of years now, and um, gone very, very deep into the subject. But this identification model I was previously to in this presentation, although it wasn't anywhere near as well refined, I was referring to it as a developmental model of gender. Um, this is to as opposed to a medical model of gender where there is a need to perform procedures to make the physical body align with one's sense of self or one's perception of self, um, or as opposed to a sort of, I guess, there has traditionally been a idea that a gender identity is something that is innate to the individual. And that's something that's never really been supported by any of the data. I would say that even prior to the sort of new phenomenon of gender that's arisen in the last 15 years or so, if you look at the research back from the 90s and things like that, then a lot of, or actually earlier than the 90s, sorry, 80s, 90s, 2000s, then it's primarily two groups of people, one of which is adult men, and one of which is young boys. The girls and women weren't really represented. They just weren't, not because they were ignored, but because they weren't really presenting clinically. And so there wasn't enough cases to form any real in-depth research into it. But a lot of the young boys who would present with sort of gender atypicality and maybe some distress or express a desire to be a girl, so on and so forth, they would eventually, usually in their late teens or perhaps earlier, puberty seems to play a mediating role for this. They would become comfortable with their biological sex, and it so happens that a large number of them would develop same-sex attraction. And that makes sense with the identification model. That this makes sense as a sort of developmental thing. 'Cause it's like a process of becoming something where you have this temporary incongruence with your sense of self as you grow and discover yourself. Um, and so that's sort of where I'd started at with the developmental um, model of gender. And I don't think as always my observations weren't particularly unique. I was borrowing off of the work of others, but this was just the shape that my thinking was taking. Um, then when you got this new cohort of gender, which people have been researching, I think one of the most promising areas of research has been the rapid onset gender dysphoria concept. Now, this has attracted a lot of controversy. I think partially because the hypothesis is that there is an element of social contagion to all of this, and I think there may be some uh, negative reaction to the term contagion because it has a connotation of sort of disgust and connotation of sort of things being a virus is a contagion. COVID had a contagious element. You sort of think of it in this negative way, but actually you can remove that term and just talk about a sort of means of social spreading or sort of social trends emerging. And this made sense. The reason this makes sense to me in terms of the developmental or identification model is that um, so the basic hypothesis of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD, was that these were children who had never identified as having any gender or never shown any signs of any gender issues prior to their adolescent years. They often had co-occurring mental health difficulties or experiences of trauma. or learning difficulties. There was a number of different things that would co-occur quite high rate, but what you would find is that they would this sort of gender distress or gender identity declaration would come from not just random patterns of individuals, but from clusters of friendship groups. And reflecting on my own time as an adolescent, particularly in secondary school, you would get these emergent clusters of people identifying with some sort of subculture or group. In my case, the first instance was probably grunge music, when me and my social circle all very rapidly, overnight, we donned plaid shirts and grew our hair out and removed every CD from our collection that wasn't a Nirvana CD. And so this idea that it was appearing in peer groups suggested that there was a social element to it. And I know that I think I first heard Az Hakim, a psychiatrist who's done a lot of work with gender, um, make this comparison where he said it felt to him very similar to him being a goth when he was younger, which is quite an amusing idea if you actually see Az now. He looks very professional, has a number of letters after his name, so the idea of him having thick eyeliner and dressing as a goth is quite amusing, but it's also beside the point. Um, and I think back to my own process, and then this is a little bit of, research is me search. It's like I automatically relate it to my own experience to some degree, but I had that grunge phase. I then had a metal phase. I then had a skater phase, a punk phase. I had all these different phases that I went through. And the basic idea that Stock suggests for this identification model is that when we look out into the world, we find things or people that we identify with and we seek to replicate or embody to some degree. And I think that's an unavoidable part of being human. Um, so sometimes it might be that we have an actor or an author or a musician or someone who we sort of idolize, or it might be a mentor in our own life, or like a sports coach or an athlete or someone like that. And as we're searching to find ourselves, particularly during adolescence, we see these people, we identify with them, and we seek to mimic and embody them. And I think this is a developmentally normal part of adolescence, because as a teenager, you believe you sort of know how to navigate the world, but it's unsophisticated compared to where it reaches as you're an adult, and it continues to grow in its sophistication as you develop. But um, the best blueprint for how to interact with the world is people who've already done it successfully, or who, by whatever metric of success that you're using. So if you see people in the world that you think, I really admire what they're doing, of course you're going to sort of try and replicate that, because that gives you a blueprint for how you should try and interact with the world. Um, and when you're a teenager, knowing who you are is it's still very early. Your body undergoes a lot of changes, your mind undergoes a lot of changes. Personality consolidation doesn't even sort of really slow down until you're in your mid-20s. And that's when neuroplasticity drops off as well. So sort of up until the age of 25, 26, you're still developing, you're still figuring out who you are, at a rapid rate. I think you're probably still figuring out who you are up until the moment you die, but you're not doing it quite as rapidly from sort of your mid-20s onwards, roughly. Obviously, referring back to my point earlier about population thinking, it doesn't apply to everyone exactly. So anyway, so I remember my experiences of going through these different transitions of joining a peer group and mimicking them and becoming like them, or finding an interest and developing that direction myself, separate from the peer group, and maybe bringing some of those peers along, or then finding peers that are associated with that. So it's a very complex interplay, but how I reflect back on that time now is that I was trying to figure out who I was. Each different phase, I found a little bit more about myself, and I took some of the things that I valued, and then I discarded some of the rest, and some of them I came back to, and some of them I have never revisited again. Um, but it strikes me that as your sense of identity becomes more and more sophisticated, you integrate smaller and smaller parts of these different identifications and create a more complex mosaic of all the different things that you've identified with throughout your life, and so it starts to more resemble a unique and new and complete version of yourself. Like, I could say now that there is still, I don't wear the plaid shirts or have the long hair, but there is still part of me that identifies with that grunge aesthetic, that values that sort of, that angst and that willingness to be different. And there's part of me that values that punk ethic, where it's sort of, you know, stick up, don't let the powers that be sort of push you down, and kick back against it when it feels wrong. And I still have a fight in my stomach that I think is heavily influenced by that identification with punk. Now, there's a chicken or egg element to that, but it's another story. Um, but then I have these interests that I developed later in my life, such as my interest in martial arts. Although there was martial arts younger in my life, I sort of really took to it 4 or 5 years ago. So I would have been in my late 20s. Um, and that's become a huge part of my life. But I would say the degree to which my entire identity rests on it is much lower than it would have been if that was an interest of mine when I was 15, 16. And part of that's just a consequence of time, because I'm now 33, so compared to a 16-year-old, I've had twice as much life, so I've had twice as many things that I identify with to integrate into my being. And part of it is just a developmental um maturity, I guess. Not that, although I'm reluctant to use the term maturity to describe myself. So, enough talking about myself, because um the less interesting part of this conversation. It's just a useful frame of reference, because it's what made what I would have previously referred to as developmental model, and what she's referring to as the identification model. Um, it's intuitively appealing, but where I think its utility is that something being developmental or being a result of identification means that it could be completely healthy. It could be something that's developed out of admiration and interest. It could be something that's developed in this ROGD model in terms of the sort of peer influence and social contagion. It could be a maladaptive coping strategy, or it could be an adaptive coping strategy. It could be something that one uh, grows out of, that is somewhat of a phase, or it could be something that someone finds themselves within. I still, for all the phases that I listed myself going through, I know people who um, never change their identification as such, although their personalities have become more sophisticated and more complex. So I'm not saying that they sort of got developmentally delayed or anything like that. But I know some people who still very strongly identify as punks, or who very strongly identify as goths, or whatever. Um, so this allows the space for a sort of atypical gender identification to be healthy as well as unhealthy. It allows for a variety of different pathways to becoming to experiencing a sort of gender confusion or a gender uncertainty, or for experimenting with different gender identities. But I think that what we have to bear in mind is the sort of first point I made, or probably not first. I don't expect me to keep track that accurately. Um, but one of the earlier points I made about the need not to obfuscate biological sex, and I think this is where the identification model can become really fraught if we don't distinguish those, because effectively, if you are identifying with something that causes you to become increasingly distressed about your biological um, reality, your physical body, then that incongruence is going to cause more distress. And so if we truly want to separate sex and gender, then we have to separate it so that we enable that experimentation, that growth, that development, without unnecessarily emphasizing the incongruence between gender and sex. Um, so it's yeah. I think that this ultimately, and if you look at this ultimately seems like the way forward in terms of understanding gender identity. And I'm sure that at some point, given how much time I spend reading on this topic, I'm sure that at some point in the future I'm going to have another book at least to discuss this topic further. I think I'm probably approaching the ends of this one here, just because um, I've been talking for a long time and I've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like I've reached a good conclusive point. But I think that the recent findings of the Cass review, which is a review that's been undertaken over a large number of years by a pediatrician called Dr. Hilary Cass, that was looking into the treatment of gender dysphoric youth in the UK, and has basically said that the medical model that we were using, where we were providing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, and so on, is not based on good evidence. The evidence base is very poor, and in some places hardly there at all, and that this has basically been very experimental, and what we need to look at is psychological interventions first. And I think this identification model matches perfectly with the direction that things seem to be going across a lot of European countries, because I know that the UK is not the first to come to this conclusion. Um, and I think that often the people who push an affirmative model of gender identity, where you just have to say yes and have to sort of go with it, often think that psychological intervention means trying to convince someone not to pursue their gender identity. And it doesn't necessarily have to do that. I would argue, and this is the case that I make because I get asked a lot about this in the social work context, because people are aware of my interest and reading on this subject. Um, I always suggest to social workers that our job is to be neutral, and the same applies for psychotherapists, to neither push towards or push away from this um, different gender identity. I always try and do that by holding a neutral space. So if someone is sort of saying to me, "Oh, we don't want to, I want to be referred to by different pronouns," for example, then I'll say, "Okay, well, there isn't really any need for me to use your pronouns when I'm talking to you a lot of the time. I won't point that out, but it's just a fact." Um, I will say something like, "That feels like a very big decision. I think that this is something that we should take some time on. So you might not feel comfortable with me using these pronouns. I don't feel comfortable sort of saying, okay, you've made that decision, let's just go with it. I feel like we have to sort of slow things down. Why don't we agree some way around this? How about I just call you by your name? And sometimes they will say, "Well, I don't want to be known by that name. I want another name," and you sort of work your way around it. One of the things that I always I always point out that women seem to be able to get away with this more than men. If a woman refers to a child by a pet name, it seems it's generally interpreted as more nurturing, whereas it can be a little bit more uncomfortable as a man to refer to a child by a pet name. Um, but I work in and live in Nottinghamshire, and it's very common for people to refer to each other as duck round here. So you can refer to a child by, you don't have to say their name, you don't have to say their pronouns. It could be like, "Hey up, duck," or one of the ones that you can get away with a little bit more as a male is mate. So, "Hey mate, how you doing?" and things like that. So you can avoid the use of names and avoid the use of pronouns. So you're not pushing them to or away from this declared gender identity. You are keeping a neutral space and keeping it open for that to be explored and for them to end up wherever they choose to end up. And that's just one example of an entire model of working with this that I mentioned earlier that I was writing. I'm writing quite a lot on this subject and researching quite a lot on this subject because I want to really flesh out a model for working with gender questioning youth in the social work context that is developmentally informed and that basically starts from this identification model and tries to incorporate the research. So that's a big project that I'm working on. And I'm not going to go into all the depths of it now because we've covered a lot of ground already. So I'm going to take that small example as a good stopping point. I'm going to allow us to surface, to take some air, and to reflect on what we've covered and what we've unearthed here. And I'm going to thank you for joining me in the depths of gender and in the depths of Material Girls by Kathleen Stock. Before you go, however, I want to leave you with a quote. Last time I did this after the outro, but I didn't feel that it worked. In the aesthetically, I think it works better beforehand. So, in case you're wondering about my production processes, so the quote I will leave you with is by Lao Tzu. "The truth is not always beautiful, nor beautiful words the truth." Thank you.